from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead for you today, K-State's Dale Blasi talking about the merits of a limit feeding program for backgrounding beef calves. He'll report on several years of K-State research on feedstuffs that make this approach work and the feeding efficiencies that can be gained, as well as some more recent findings Dale will share in just a moment. Following then, K-State's Jeff Whitworth on the appearance of winter grain mites in Kansas winter wheat stands now. He'll comment on whether those require a treatment response at this stage of the growing season. And on this week's horticulture segment further ahead, K-State's Raymond Cloyd will advise on applying dormant oil insecticides to landscape ornamental and fruit trees. All that right here on Agriculture Today. Welcome once again to another Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along. Our guest now has been talking up this concept for quite some time now, and in fact has advanced the research into it from various angles in recent years. Dale Blasi is a beef cattle nutritionist, K-State Research and Extension. He is still discussing this idea with producers who are raising growing calves this time of the year, what's called limit feeding those calves. Before we talk of some of the newer things you've learned about this of late, Dale, what is meant by limit feeding?
Well, Eric, limit feeding essentially means that we rely heavily on the NRC requirements. We know exactly how much energy and protein is required for an animal to gain whatever desired level of performance that you want. And you dial the level of intake back from, say, a full-fed ad lib diet at about 2.8% of the animal's weight in terms of dry matter consumption. You'll dial it back to 2.2. As a consequence, basically it simplifies the feeding approach, and you have the predictability from the NRC equations that are used, and basically you're able to gain added feed efficiency. It greatly, as I indicated, simplifies feeding, once-a-day feeding as opposed to two-day feeding. Your bunk line, your bunk path stays cleaner, and it does a much better job of actually finding sick calves as a consequence of them not having full access to full feed all the time.
Digging deeper here, when you're discussing feeding efficiency, how do you define that, and what are you discovering about limit feeding approaches toward that end?
Well, feed efficiency is essentially pounds of feed per pound of gain. Okay, so if we're looking at 6 pounds of feed to translate into 1 pound of live animal growth, we're able to improve that by about 28 to 35%. So we can get the same level of performance with that amount of reduced feed required for that animal.
It's very straightforward, really.
It is.
But getting there is the trick, right?
Right. And the approach that we've taken, understand limit feeding's been around since the 80s, the 1980s. Our different take on this approach is that we're able to feed a diet that almost approaches the level of energy seen in feedlot diets, but we're able to get around the issues with acidosis and everything with higher grain levels for these growing calves by using about 40% co-products, that being wet distillers grains, wet corn gluten feed. We've looked at a variety of different co-products, but it seems to circulate right around that area of about 40% co-product, 38% corn, and only about 13% roughage, which in our state of Kansas, different areas always seem to be in drought. And roughages in and of themselves are a real challenge to deal with. When you're trying to build a TMR diet, you have to grind it. It's got to be available. And then it's really a hard challenge, if you will, to keep those bunks clean with rain events and snow events. What we do is we're only using 13% roughage in our diets as opposed to, say, a 40% roughage in a traditional ad lib diet. We get the same level of performance, and generally we can reduce our costs anywhere from 10 to 15% as a consequence of that. So we're able to do a better job with these calves. They come in, we'll feed them 1% of this limit-fed diet after 1 day of 1% hay, and we'll bump them up about 0.25% of body weight for 5 days generally, and we'll hold them at 2.2. So we'll have them on their actual diet in 5 days, as opposed to taking anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to get them up to where you want. And during that period of time when these calves are newly arrived, if you're talking about long-haul, highly stressed calves, really getting a good idea on which animals are sick and which ones are not, the limit feeding approach really facilitates the job of identifying those calves that are not coming up to the bunk to eat.
Just to clarify, these are total mixed rations you're putting out there.
They are total mixed rations, and it's key to know the weight of the calves coming in. That's really where you start the entire calculation. And, you got a 5-weight calf. You start off at 1% of its body weight. You start off at 5 pounds of this product on a dry matter basis, and you bump it up each day. If they're cleaning it up at the bunk, 5.25, 5.5, you just bring them up, and then every week, every 2 weeks, you adjust for that increase in body weight, you increase that amount. So it stays fairly constant. All you're doing is increasing the amount of that feed based upon where your desired dry matter intake might be. The other thing is the energy density of the diet. When you got a lot of fluff in there, a lot of diluent, if you will, from the roughages, it takes longer to process the feed in the wagon, and you're not able to spread or carry as much of that feed in the wagon across the number of calves you may have at your disposal. So consequently, you might be able to feed a set of 300 calves with one load of a feed box, as opposed to making 2 loads with a diet that's primarily composed of roughage, say 30 or 40% roughage. So you're able to get it done quicker. The other thing that's beautiful about this approach, and we've done to date about 9 research trials looking at this, if those calves are fed in the morning hours, those bunks are essentially stripped bare by about 5 to 6 hours after you feed. There is nothing inside those bunks. So if there's a rain event or anything where you have to go back and clean bunks, those calves are done eating, they sit down, they ruminate, and they basically are trained to wait until the next day, until they hear that tractor coming, and they know it's time to eat, and they will be up there. And again, as I pointed out earlier with the animal health aspects, if there's an animal holding back for whatever reason and they're not ready to eat, something is going on there with that animal. And so this approach really facilitates the animal health detection.
And you hinted at this just a second ago in what you said. You have continued to build upon this idea through new research approaches here. As far as bunk management and, moreover, bunk space, you say you found out a few things.
Right. We finished a study up early this year. Actually, it was during January, February, March. We looked at 4 different spacings of bunk, 25, 20, 15, and 10 inches per animal. And we actually saw no significant differences between 10, 15, 20, and 25 inches. And that's really important, Eric, because concrete bunks are expensive. You start looking at aprons to put everything together. And certainly we're not advocating going to the 10, but you're able to squeeze more calves in and get the job done with no negative effects on animal performance in what we detected. So we've also looked at winter feeding either in the morning or night, and also had calves where we would feed them and they would eat in 6 hours, and we would basically move them out and bring another set of calves in and feed them that night. And so we're doubling the number of animals with our fixed space of bunks. It takes added labor, no question about it, but we saw no differences in performance between, say, a young producer starting out and having fixed length of bunk space. They got a holding area for calves that might be fed at the night, and then they can rotate them out and feed that other set of calves in the morning.
So that's an overhead efficiency.
It's an overhead efficiency, and it really lends itself very well to do so.
One other aspect of this, we could spend a great deal of time on many more here. As far as a chore that all cattle feeders well understand, that is cleaning those pens, there can be a distinct advantage there via limit feeding.
Absolutely. One thing about limit feeding is when you're limiting intake of an animal, the rate of passage through the gut of the animal is slowed down tremendously. And what we have seen through numerous intake and digestibility studies using ruminally cannulated calves is that our digestibility of the diet is improved by about 10%. 10 percentage units. It's amazing. And as a consequence of a greater proportion of that feed being digested, there is less manure output coming out. About 45% less manure coming out. So
that's notable.
It's significant. And, this manure management is a millstone around a lot of producers' operations. And so you don't have the compaction issues, the weed issues with how you apply that manure nutrient. So it vastly reduces the amount of manure output by feeding this animal, this feeding practice.
Dale, you and your team have been hard at this for years, looking at limit feeding and the approaches to growing these calves where that program fits. Where can a producer go to learn more about it, to put it that way?
We have a bunch of papers in the Cattleman's Day reports that is located at ksubeef.org. I might also mention we have an ongoing study right now. Dr. Tarpoff is leading a project at present looking at the use of shade and whether you limit feed or ad lib feed with the benefit or non-benefit of shade. And we just finished the first year, and we're moving forward to the second year, and we're looking at if limit feeding plus shade represents more efficiency for these animals, looking at heat of fermentation and everything from the added roughages that are included in the diet. So a lot of good stuff happening, Eric.
You're not going to exhaust the ideas that could be plugged into this concept, so we're looking forward to the next information that you churn out on limit feeding, growing calves. Dale, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Eric.
Beef cattle nutritionist, K-State Research and Extension. That's Dale Blasi, opening up this Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now. Well, we're at the point of the year now when we tend to worry very little about insects being active in our crop fields. And in fact, there are only a handful of crops actively growing now. Wheat is primary among them here in Kansas. But our guest informs us here that there is at least one pest, and maybe two, that you growers might want to monitor here in the coming weeks. Jeff Whitworth is on the phone with us from Wichita, where he's attending the Kansas Agribusiness Expo and talking shop with folks down there. Jeff, you're getting word from growers about winter grain mites in wheat. Fill us in on what's going on out there.
Yes, good morning, and my pleasure to be here. It is that time of year as one of the concerns, and every year it happens, it seems like, is the winter grain mite. Now, winter grain mites, they get on a lot of the native grasses. They're in the weedy waterways where there's grass. They're in brome. But wheat being a grass, they get in wheat, and especially wheat fields that have not had the volunteer wheat taken care of in as timely a manner as it could. Now, this year, we had pretty good growing conditions early on. Most of the fields that I've seen, at least lately, they germinated pretty well. The wheat's come up, and it's gotten a pretty good head start. Now we need some more moisture. But a lot of it seems like it's going or has just gone or will go shortly into dormancy. Mm-hmm. And I'm starting to get calls about winter grain mites. And that's always the question. Winter grain mites are, as the name implies, they do best in winter or just the month preceding the coldest part of the winter. They like temperatures 40 to 65 degrees when it's cool. They will feed at night when it's just down into the 40s. So a lot of times we don't even notice it, but I've noticed a couple of populations. I've been out looking at some fields. The populations are building up pretty good. Now, the problem with not having moisture is these mites, you can see them with the naked eye, but they're really small and they're really shy, and they generally feed at night or in clouding days. The best time to go out and look, if you want to go out and monitor a sample, see if you have winter grain mites, is go out at night with a flashlight. They're pretty readily visible. They'll be up on the leaves, a lot of times down at the lower part of the plant, but they have what looks like, just with the naked eye, a dark body and red legs. They're very distinctively colored. If you look at them under 10-pound magnification, they will have red legs and then a little red spot on their abdomen, but the they're easily distinguished from some of the other mites. And the other mites won't be active this time of year for the most part. For the most part, if you find big populations of mites, they're going to be wintergreen mites. And the wintergreen mite feeds by puncturing a cell, individual cells of the plant, and sucking the juice out. If we have good growing conditions, that's not a problem. Mm-hmm. Usually, most of the time, the wheat will outgrow wintergreen mites. But this time of year, especially when we have dry conditions, and we're not sure if the wheat's in dormancy or not, which a lot of guys are not sure, and they get wintergreen mites, the first indication is if you drive by the field, the wheat will look kind of a silvery color because as they suck that plant juice out, it leaves a shrunken cell and that sucks the chlorophyll out, so it's not green. And if you have a pretty good population, the tips of the leaves will start to turn brown. If the plants are still growing well, that's not a problem. Like I said, most of the time, the plants will outgrow a winter grain mite infestation. But right now, they're not growing that well, and some of these mites are causing some relatively highly visible damage. Now, the key here is if the wheat's in dormancy. If the wheat's in dormancy, they're not going to hurt anything. They're not going to bother that wheat. And as soon as it gets a little colder down into the 20s at night and up into the 50s during the day, the mites will lay eggs and go dormant for the winter. And then the next question is, what happens in the spring? Well, in the spring they come back in, every year's a little different, but usually mid to late February as the temperatures start to warm up a little bit. And again, those eggs will hatch, those mites will start feeding, and they do the same thing. They puncture the cell and they suck the juice out of the cell, and they will rob the plant of its moisture under dry conditions. That can be really tough for the plants. If we have good moisture conditions, it's not a problem. Mm-hmm. So if you have a relatively heavy infestation of wintergreen mites, and by that I mean if you can see, most people don't want to go out and count mites, but if you actually go out at night and count them, you have to get down on your hands and knees. But if you have 10 or 20 mites per leaf, that's a pretty healthy infestation. So if you have it now and the plants are going into dormancy, it's not going to hurt. But you need to remember where those infestations are for the following spring or early spring, late winter time frame when those populations are still going to be there and those eggs are going to start hatching and those mites are going to start feeding on the wheat.
Going by what you're saying, there seems to be no reason for even thinking about treating for these mites then.
I have heard of a couple people already gearing up to treat for wintergreen mites. We don't really recommend that because, like I said, what we really want to do now is get out and monitor. And if we do have populations that might indicate, going into the early spring, there could be a problem, just mark that and keep that in the back of your mind so you can go out and in the late winter, early spring, and take a check, monitor the situation, see if they're still there as those eggs start to hatch.
Quick thought here, Jeff. Would the cropping history on that field in any way impact the presence of grain mites?
Continuous wheat fields are more subjected to winter grain mites because they have to have a grass to feed on, and they can't move much. They're like any other non-winged insect. They're subjected to the wind. The wind can blow them around, or they crawl from leaf to leaf where there's overlapping leaves, but they just don't move much. Now, if it's not a continuous wheat field, sometimes you'll see the wintergreen mites moving out from a grass border or grass waterway or something out of it. So they'll be the silvery edges to the border of the field. In the spring, then they may move further into the field as conditions allow. But right now, I really do not recommend treating for wintergreen mites. Remember, it takes a lot to do a lot of damage, and this time of year they're not going to do that much damage. But if you have never seen wintergreen mites, go out now with a flashlight, and it's something that you will learn from.
All right, and before we let you get away, you tell us as well that you're hearing a report or two about army cutworms making an appearance in wheat here and there now.
I've gotten a call, or maybe two, about army cutworms. If you remember this past summer, we had a real problem with army worms, and fall armyworms in brome and alfalfa, and last spring in wheat. The armyworms and the fall armyworms are not causing a problem right now. At least I've not gotten any calls. I think most of the fall armyworms went south. The adults, the moths, went south for the winter to overwinter. I don't think they overwinter in Kansas. Armyworms, true armyworms, they probably do, but I have not gotten any calls, nor have I seen any armyworms for about the last 2 months. But army cutworms, that's a different story. The army cutworm moth over summers in the mountains of Colorado and other places, and then they fly east to Kansas and lay eggs as they come. And so they get about to 75 highway maybe in Kansas, and between there and the mountains they lay eggs. 2 years ago we had a real problem with army cutworms. Now the worms are there now. They overwinter as a larva, and right now I've seen a few, but they're really small. The damage isn't going to show up. The key now, if you see a flock of blackbirds or other kinds of birds, turkeys out in the field, go out and look. The worms are really small. They're about, the ones I've seen are about a fourth or a half an inch, and they're in the soil. They won't be up feeding on the plants, but they will feed all winter long, anytime the temperature's up to 45, 48 degrees, and so they'll keep developing. So once spring hits, they will be larger, and that's usually when the damage starts showing up, and they will be in wheat or alfalfa. They get in lawns, anything green, but as far as crops go, the problem we had 2 years ago, not so much last year in the spring of 2021, but a little bit, the army cutworms, and it will show up, and they really decimated some fields up in north central Kansas, especially in the spring of 2020, a little bit 2021. So just keep your eyes out, because they're here. They're just getting started. The key is to locate these populations while they're small if you can. Monitor them. Again, they're not going to hurt anything in the winter because everything's dormant. So just keep that, like I said, on your map or in the back of your mind for checking out again in the spring.
The whole idea here is to be proactive by knowing what's out there, scout your fields right now for either of those pests, and make according plans to deal with them come springtime, really is the message here. Jeff, thanks for letting us know, and we will catch up with you again soon, possibly at the beginning of the growing season, but something may come along between now and then. Who knows? We'll talk with you in any event at that point in time. Many thanks to you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Eric.
Jeff Whitworth is a crop entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more for you. You're listening to Agriculture Today. This Agriculture Today comes to a close on the horticulture beat once more with Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. Of course, colder weather means that insect activity has rapidly wound down. There are a few things to tend to before we call it good for 2021, though, Raymond. One of those is various invading insect species showing up in the home now.
Yeah, Eric, we would call them unwelcome invaders or occasional invaders, and these are the insects that are going to come in your home to overwinter. Some examples: Asian ladybird beetle. Everybody recognizes that, where they come in, they harbor on the south side of the building, in the corners of windows. The box elder bug, the elm leaf beetle, other insects that would come in. Cluster flies would be another example. But again, most of these are just coming in to reside for the wintertime, and the best way to deal with them is to crack and crevices, remove openings, and if they do make their way in, just vacuum them and put them outside. The Asian ladybird beetle, you don't want to squish it because it leaves a stain. None of these will transmit a disease. Some will bite you, but just vacuum them out and put them outside, and that's the best way to deal with them. But yeah, this time of year we start getting those calls: crickets, millipedes, centipedes coming in for the wintertime, and a lot of them just won't survive because the humidity is really low in the wintertime. So a lot of my crickets will dry up, but the Asian ladybird beetle and specifically will make it around till spring. And in spring they'll get active and they'll want to go outside.
Now, you may have to do a bit of work finding out where they're entering the home, but that's the real cure for this, and that is excluding those bugs.
That would be one. You could spray an insecticide on the south side as a repellent, but I mean, basically the best way is to fix any cracks and crevices, make it harder for them to get inside.
Something that can be conducted this time of the year in protecting certain landscape trees from various insect troubles, dormant oil treatments. And as the name would imply, those would be administered fairly soon.
Yeah, dormant oils are not the same as your summer oils, which are applied in fall, spring, and summer. These have a different level of unsulfonated residues. And so if you have fruit trees or trees that have lost their leaves or deciduous, this is the time you can do it. And these dormant oils are effective on killing the eggs or other overwintering stages of insects and mites that overwinter on the trees. The fruit tree growers use that a lot for certain scale insects and European red mite on apples. But this would be between now and February would be the time to apply maybe 2 applications of a dormant oil to kill some of those overwintering life stages that would occur on trees and shrubs. That if you don't apply them when the leaves are there, you can burn them and such. That'll help for next year, alleviate hopefully problems for early spring of next year.
Is this especially important for certain trees? You mentioned fruit trees, for instance, but general ornamentals, this is also an appropriate tactic?
Well, for ornamentals, I think spruce spider mite would be an example of the overwintering on eggs, but it's on conifers, and you don't want to burn your plants. A lot of dormant oils are applied to maples, oaks that have lost their leaves, but for apples and pears and peaches and nectarines, the fruit trees, they're used against certain insects and mites that overwinter as the egg stage or another life stage that's susceptible to these dormant oils.
You can inquire at your local garden center. They'll have the proper materials for getting this done, and of course, read the label on the product. That'll give you guidance as well.
Right. And the other thing, Eric, we probably should talk about is going into winter, you got to make sure your trees have got water, because you don't want them to be stressed, especially in wintertime when the wind picks up. It can desiccate them. So probably would be time if you have some trees and shrubs to give them some irrigation so they don't go through the winter dry. Because if they come out in the spring stressed, then they're much more susceptible to insect and mite pest.
We will have you back sometime in the spring, Raymond, to talk more about emerging insect problems as they're turning up. It's been a good year. Thanks for being along with us regularly, and we will talk again soon.
Always enjoyed, Eric, and look forward to 2022.
Indeed. Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, with us for this week's horticulture segment. And with that, our Thursday edition comes to a close. Thanks, as always, for listening in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.